Hello, everyone. It's Lisa Turner here from Psychademy, Leaders in Spiritual Evolution and Personal Transformation. So today I want to share with you the single most limiting of limiting beliefs. You've probably heard about the idea of limiting beliefs. So what's the most limiting one? And something that's quite exciting that I'm kind of playing with as a new idea that I wanted to share with you, which is the idea of the 3 levels of consciousness and the role of trauma or tragedy in spiritual awakening. So let's start with the middle one, the 3 levels of consciousness. Now, there's lots of levels of consciousness, and you can talk in depending on the model. So I'm going to present to you today in this live, this model, which is about pre-tragic or pre-trauma, trauma, and trauma / post-trauma, which you might call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and then beyond trauma, beyond tragedy. So pre-trauma is where life makes sense, life is fun, life is joyful. There are rules, if you like, or ideas that you have about life that work. Good things happen to good people. If I'm a good person, good things will happen to me. Bad things will happen to bad people. If bad people do bad things, then bad things will happen to them. And then you have some kind of experience. Like, so up until this point, like, life works. Life is sweet. Life is joyful. It makes sense. It feels fair. Now, those are some rules I've given you. You might have your own set of rules, but it works within that construct of rules. But then something happens. Something like, you believe you're a good person, and yet a bad thing happens to you. How can you reconcile this? You did good things and bad things happen, or you start to notice the pain and the suffering of the world. And you cannot reconcile it with the old rule book or the old set of ideas that you had. It's irreconcilable. It makes no sense. And suddenly life has no meaning because it makes no sense. Everything is very confusing. And this is where you experience what you might call PTSD. In fact, I did a lot of work with ex-Marines suffering from PTSD. And the single biggest, the thing that would trigger, they could, see, the thing is, in pre-trauma, you can experience suffering, but the suffering makes sense. I did a bad thing, I'm going to get punished. So within the construct of your rule book, it makes sense. And then you have trauma that is outside of the rules, the guidelines that you've programmed into your head, so that it no longer makes any kind of sense for you. So when I was working with Marines and ex-Marines who were suffering from PTSD, the single thing that they all had in common, because I look at patterns, the single thing they had was there was a point at which, so they'd done terrible things, or they'd experienced and witnessed terrible things, and they all believed it was for the greater good, that they were fighting a war that had a purpose. And at some point, either the level of suffering or the context, it's like the suffering lost its context. So that no amount, it doesn't matter how important or worthwhile this war is, nothing can justify this behavior or this experience. And then boom, and it would be like, that's it. They're in PTSD. Now, for some people, it would be the level of trauma, and that triggered the loss of meaning. And for some people, the loss of meaning came first, and then even a relatively small trigger of trauma, small level of trauma would trigger PTSD. And because this is what triggers that fight or flight. They're on constant high alert because their experience no longer makes sense. They no longer have the rules. Oh, I'm safe here because wars don't happen here, or, this is okay. It's okay if a bad thing happens because it has a purpose. It's like, if there's no purpose, there's no meaning, there's no rules, anything could go terribly wrong at any moment. So this is when you're in PTSD. Now, so in this point, and you may not have had PTSD from a war. You just might be in what we would label trauma or post-trauma, because the rules have broken down. The level of suffering is no longer, or the context of the suffering. So you're a good person, and yet this bad thing happened to you. You got burgled. You lost your job. Your husband left you. Your wife left you. And it's like, I was a good husband or wife. How could this happen? How could this happen is often a common question that will signal that that's where you are. Now, sometimes people live in that, and they are in this, they find coping mechanisms, or what they do is, so what they do is they attempt then to go back to pre-trauma. And they do this by trying to find meaning in the suffering. So an example of this is a woman who is raped, suffers PTSD, and then forms a whole movement about ending rape culture. Or somebody who is in an abusive relationship, who then forms a support group or support movement for helping women suffering from PTSD. Or a mother whose child has died in a particular way, sets up a charity, and her life becomes around funding research into whatever it was her child. So it's like the essence of it is, they have the trauma, and then they try and find meaning, and they change their life in order to give that horrific experience some kind of meaning and some positive outcome, some positive sense making of it. And they'll say things like, this is the only way I could make sense of what happened. I needed to turn it around so it felt okay that this terrible thing had happened. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Like that's okay. There's no judgment here. That's a strategy, and like a heck of a lot of good has come out of that kind of going to pre-trauma. But it is going to pre-trauma. You're attempting to go back to the place where there must be meaning, there must be sense. Now, then you come to beyond trauma. Now, this is almost worthy of a whole Facebook Live, honestly, in fact, this is really what our initiation program is, and what our spiritual practitioner program is really all about, because it's enabling you to move to beyond trauma so that you no longer need the rules in order to attribute meaning to the traumatic experience and then make sense of it. When you're beyond trauma, you are in this place of versus. So in pre-trauma or post-trauma, where you've gone back to pre-trauma, there's the need to have things make sense. So there's a knowing you need to get. When you're in beyond trauma, when you're there, you have this sense of wisdom and really understanding things from even a beyond, okay, I'm going to set up a charity that solves this. It's like, actually, we're solving it at an even higher and higher level. And that doesn't mean you sit there and do nothing and just meditate it all away. There's something beyond. Now, what that beyond for you will be for you is individual to you, and how you bring in this wisdom, how you love that experience in a way that is not what people even normally use the term love, because it's part of the evolutionary journey, and you can see it and experience and create a whole new level of energy, of success, of understanding, of wisdom, and especially of support for those who are in the trauma, pre-trauma and post-trauma, and attempting to go back to pre-trauma. There's a whole level of presence you can bring to that will help them move into beyond trauma. And this is what I believe is what is happening now as this spiritual awakening of the planet is happening, that we are moving beyond these first two levels. Pre-trauma, rules, I've got rules, they make sense, they're obeyed, to post-trauma, the rules are broken down, so I'll find a whole new set of rules to move to pre-trauma. We're moving beyond that to beyond trauma, beyond tragic, where this whole new level of awakening will happen. Now, by definition, this is beyond words, so the things I'm saying will often make no sense. And I know that people are going to post, and they will be attempting to work at those two levels, pre-trauma and post-trauma. That's okay, because it's almost the explanation of beyond trauma is almost by definition beyond words. So let's come to the most limiting of limiting beliefs. And it's the limiting belief that stops you moving from post-trauma to beyond trauma. And it's the limiting belief that some things just can't be changed and therefore have to be endured. What if that was just a limiting belief? Now, I'm going to leave that with you for you to meditate on and contemplate on. And my invitation is to avoid any knee-jerk responses to that question. What if the thing that is most limiting to you was just a limiting belief? Now, if you've been around me and followed me on any Facebook Lives, you'll know that we create our reality through our beliefs. So anything that seems true is potential. If it limits you, it's a limiting belief. If it gives our whole life is created by beliefs, and some of these beliefs empower and some of them disempower, and that's why we call them limiting beliefs. And as you evolve, as you move through that process of evolution, what you'll find is what empowered you at this stage starts to disempower you. So the process of empowerment and evolution and awakening is constantly letting go of that which doesn't expand your mind totally and completely. Anything that causes any kind of restriction, that isn't your choice. So realizing that all beliefs are in some way limiting. It's just whether they limit you in a way that gives you structure that you can build on and grow from, or whether it restricts to prevent growth. Yeah. It's the difference between soil that nurtures and soil that, like clay, that cloys and stops the growth. So all beliefs in some way will limit, but do they limit in a way that gives you structure, or do they limit in a way that enables, do they limit in a way that gives you structure so that you can create growth, or do they limit in a way that actually stops you growing? Do they create growth, enable growth, or stop growth? Alrighty, that's my little share for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. If you liked it, click the like button. If you want to share it, click the share button. Until next time, lots and lots of love. Bye for now.